Good morning. I'm News Center Maine's Don Kerrigan, sitting in this morning, standing really, for Pat Callahan, joined by our intrepid political brew analysts Phil Harriman and Betsy Sweet. Good morning to both of you. Let's talk some Maine issues. In particular, this week, Governor Janet Mills issued the first vetoes of this legislative session, 7 of them on Thursday. And Betsy, are you surprised that it took this long?
I'm not surprised that it took this long. I am surprised by some of them, and I think it's really unfortunate. I think that the veto to ban foreign corporations from participating in our elections and our referendum processes that got strong bipartisan support in both bodies of the legislature, and I don't think that's a politically or a policy thing that most Mainers agree with. So I was surprised at that one. I don't know that I was surprised, but very disappointed in her veto of the gradual closing of Long Creek, so that we don't keep kids in cages, and that was very sad to me. I think that, there's a couple of law and order ones, and I think it's hard for her to get away from being a prosecutor. But I think times are changing. But
made it very clear that the governor, she has some very clear opinions on some of this, doesn't she?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely, and that's never been her problem.
Bill, what do you think on this?
I'm not surprised by it because the more challenging pieces of legislation tend to get to the governor's desk later in the session. So this is the time of the year when more substantive policy decisions have been made by the legislature. But what it does tell me, Dawn, is that behind the closed doors, there's growing tension between Democrat legislators and Democrat governor. I'm sure that's not uncommon, regardless of the administration, but it's going to be interesting to see based on these vetoes. And remember, there's still a budget bill that needs to be passed that's going to likely need a 2/3 vote. It's going to be very interesting to see how the governor's relationship with her colleagues in the Democrat side of the legislature are going to be able to work together from here on out.
Let's talk about that, because the legislature's scheduled to come back June 30th, this coming week, to wrap up business. They have about 30 bills left to vote on. Some may have already had partial votes. Some may just be starting, but about 30 bills. But the biggest pieces of this will be the remainder of the new 2-year budget and the approval of the plan for spending that $1 billion in federal COVID relief money. Phil, do you expect bipartisan agreement, or do you expect this to maybe break down along party lines again?
I hope it can get a 2/3 vote for immediate enactment of the legislation. And in order for that to happen, the Democrat leaders in the legislature are going to have to accept and welcome some of the Republican priorities. And I think the governor is going to have to do a good job of lobbying individual legislators in her party to get this done. But I do think that's the goal that they all want to reach.
And Betsy, early in the week, they sort of took what you might refer to as the low-hanging fruit of this, approved increasing school funding to finally meet 55% and increase revenue sharing to towns and cities to get that back to the 5% it used to be at. So those were the easy ones. There are hard decisions left.
Yeah, there are hard decisions, but they're getting places. I mean, they all agreed unanimously to include dental coverage in our Medicaid program. That's huge. They agreed to fund the Permanent Commission on Racism and Indigenous Tribes. That's huge. So I think they're getting pretty close. And I think, kudos to the legislature for passing a baseline budget early on, so that this conversation is really about how do we innovate and how do we move us forward coming out of the pandemic. And we're not having this tearing our hair out that there's going to be a government shutdown. So I think they are working hard to get to 2/3. I know the governor really wants them to get to 2/3. And I think most of the legislators do too. But I think it's going to take compromise on both sides.
Right. And there was hard feeling back at the end of March when they did a Democratic budget for the baseline budget, as you called it. And I suspect they probably do not want to end on that same note this time if they can avoid it, right?
Well, I don't think any Republican wants to be on the side of voting against the school fund 55% for schools and revenue sharing. So I think that's a good motivator to get everybody on board.
But the other side of that is that these new initiatives, whether it's the dental care for Maine Care or increase in education, is built on one-time money coming out of Washington, which means they're going to have to have the economic engine purring along to generate the revenues to keep them going.
Right, because once you do that, you can't pull them back very
Right.
easily, can
Right.
you? Very upsetting news this past week, the high number of opioid deaths again for the first quarter of the year. Is there anything that government is not doing, Phil, that it ought to be doing to try to help this problem? Or is it something government can't really do?
Well, they have the power of prosecution, and rather than focusing on users and the medical mayhem that's out there, there needs to be, in my opinion, a stronger enforcement action on who's dealing these drugs, where are they coming from, how are they getting into our country, and who are the distributors, and let's focus on that.
Yeah. And I couldn't disagree more. I think, the whole problem is that we have treated this as a criminal issue, and it's a public health issue. And there's a lot that we can do, but we have to do it at the front end. We have to look at the adverse childhood experiences, the community mental health system, which is not accessible to most people. Those are the places where we could start to make sure that people don't go down the road of addiction. And, we can just look to other countries and other places where they're making huge strides. And the first thing that they're doing is looking at how they use it, look at it as a mental health and as a health pandemic and as a health issue, and not as a criminal issue. We cannot continue to do what we have done for decades, which is make it a war on drugs. The war on drugs, the criminalization of this doesn't work. And until we shift that thinking, we will never get a handle on this.
Yet I think Phil's argument is they need to do more of an effort going after the supply and the
Correct.
Source.
Well,
Correct.
that can continue, but that's not how it plays out in our local areas. It doesn't play out with the dealers. It plays out on the users. And
that's my point, Betsy, is that they need to change the focus from the users to the dealers.
Well, right, and that's a federal issue. So, but I think, and I think unless we have mental health services and we have access to recovery services and helping kids at the young age not have those adverse childhood experiences, then we're not going to get a handle on this. And we have to change it from a criminal issue to a public health issue.
And finally, Maine continues to wrestle with this serious worker shortage. All kinds of businesses, probably almost every business you run into is having a struggle finding workers. Particular problem, of course, for the tourism industry because they need people for the summer. They're not getting them. The state has put in an incentive for people to go after and take jobs. We're hearing from employers who are saying it's time for the state to end the unemployment bonus to try to give more of a prod to people to go out and look for jobs. Phil, I'll start with you. Do you think either of those approaches are right?
Well, I think all of the above. The safety net that we build for people who are unemployed is to make sure that they can get by until there is better economic opportunities, and they're here. People who can work should go to work. Employers know that they've got to pay what the market will bear, and if that raises wages because of a competitive employment opportunity, so be it. But the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers, so to speak, by creating these subsidies that really aren't needed because there are opportunities out there for people to work.
Yeah, and I don't think we have a worker shortage. I think we have a pay and benefit shortage. I think the businesses who are struggling are the ones who are trying to pay minimum wage or just barely above with no benefits, no full-time work. And those are the people having trouble. I know in my own town, the restaurants that are looking at paying bare minimum and, not providing any paid time off or anything, they're having trouble. The restaurants that aren't doing that, they're doing fine. And so I think we have to switch looking at this as not a worker shortage and the issues of childcare and the things that people need to have to go to work. That's where we need to address this. And I think, one-time bonuses, that's maybe the incentive, but it only lasts so long. And so I think if you have a business model that is dependent on not paying people enough to live on, if they're working for you 40 hours a week, it's not a sustainable business model. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Here we are. It's almost the end of June, and it looks like in Washington there is finally a bipartisan agreement with the White House on an infrastructure package, and it looks like Senator Collins has played a key role in pulling this together. Phil, start with you. What do you think of this?
Well, as always, Susan Collins is approachable and open-minded, and that's a good characteristic to have in Washington these days. But I wouldn't read too much into this at least halftime celebration, because Democrats are also saying that there needs to be a human infrastructure bill. And the president, while he was complimenting the bipartisan approach on the bill they discussed on Thursday, that there is clearly more bills that the president wants on his desk before he will sign the one they were celebrating on Thursday. And Democrats are complaining that this package wasn't broad enough and big enough. So, so far so good, but a long ways to go.
Yeah, I think we have a long ways to go. And honestly, I think that Manchin and Sinema have more to do with this package than any of the Republicans, because they weren't going to get their votes. And that's what they needed to do it through reconciliation, which was the original plan. So, I think Phil's right. But I think, we have got to get past, the big news was they're including broadband in infrastructure. Well, that's great. But the human infrastructure is really important. We can have all the infrastructure in the world, but if there's no workers, because there's no daycare, because there's nobody to take care of, elderly mom and dad, we're not going to be able to fill those jobs. So we have to expand it. I think Phil's right. We've got a long way to go here, but I think it's a good thing for Maine. And anybody who's been out for a drive lately knows we desperately need it.
Absolutely. So are we reading this that it's a quid pro quo, where that they won't pass the true infrastructure unless this human one also gets passed?
That was my interpretation of what the president said. He was cheering on the great bipartisan work, but said he wasn't going to sign it unless the Senate sent him another spending package to go along with it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that package has a different pathway. They can do that through reconciliation. So
they can. You're right, but he made it clear he's signing both or none.
Yeah.
And the money still has to be found from somewhere, which means sooner or later there's going to have to be a tax increase debate, doesn't it?
Either that or a massive tax expenditure or spending reduction, which I don't see that happening in the next several years.
Yeah. Vice President Kamala Harris making her long-awaited trip to the southern border on Friday, ahead of the one that President Trump has planned. How important is it for the vice president to actually get their boots on the ground, as it were, on the southern border, talking about that immigration problem? Betsy?
I think it's really important. And I think I was really glad to see that she went to the countries where many of these refugees are coming from to talk about what's going on in those countries and how we can help stem the desperation that people must feel to make that kind of trip when they know there's an uncertain future there. And I also think that, it's really interesting that the first big splash that Trump is making is at the border. He is doing a racist dog whistle. It's what he does. It's how he gins people up. And so I think to go there and actually be a statesperson and to really talk about how we solve these problems is important to sort of stem that tide of the sort of racist fervor that I think Trump is going to try and whip up.
I see it a little differently. I think the lack of appearance by the vice president or the president at the border earlier on in their after being sworn in spoke volumes. The untold number of people who came in here undocumented with COVID virus and other problems that our society has to address was very telling. They essentially opened the border. Now that they've had their sort of feedback from the public, finally the vice president is going there to make basically a photo op. And I think if you ask Americans, regardless of party affiliation, they would say, yes, we should have an immigration process where you are welcome into our country, but come through the front door. Do it legally as others have.
Yeah. Now, we've obviously had this illegal immigration for years and years and years, and it's going to continue. Go ahead, Betsy.
Just a quick fact check. Biden has kept the number of immigrants coming from the southern border at the same level as Trump. Mm-hmm. So it's not, they didn't just floor open the doors. And so that's not accurate. So I think we have to say that. And they're looking for those legal ways, those helpful ways to actually bring people through.
Here's the big question. Is the federal government, meaning the White House, the Congress, all of it, are they even capable of true solution to this problem?
Well, yeah, I think there has to be a will. And the will is that we are a country of laws and borders that make us a sovereign nation. And I don't think there's agreement on that. So that's the first step, in my view.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's going to be an economic issue. With this desperate worker shortage that we have, we need people to come to this country. And to have a legal, safe way for them to do that I think is going to push both sides to come to some kind of agreement.
Briefly, we've got this standoff in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, over a voting reform bill. Republicans not letting it pass in the Senate. Is this issue dead, Betsy, or do you think it's going to keep going to get more federal control, if you will, over the voting process.
Yeah, it's not dead as long as there's all these bills being introduced in the states to restrict voting rights, right? So I think what's going to happen now is they're going to take apart the whole package and start doing them one at a time. And, we've got to start, voting is sort of the sacred thing that happens in this country, sacred to our democracy. And to see the restrictions on this, instead of voters deciding who's elected, the electeds are now trying to decide who's the voters. So I think no one's going to stop.
Yeah, but Phil, we have a long tradition of the states setting their voting rules.
Yeah, and I think that is really important to maintain. And I also think we should listen to the citizens who are electors who say, I think a recent poll that I saw, Dawn and Betsy, was that 80% of Americans believe that there should be voter ID. That tells me that it doesn't matter what party you're with. As an American, you want to make sure that the people who are voting are actual citizens who've been identified.
Let's go to winners and losers for the week. Betsy, you first.
Well, my winner for the week is Representative Maggie O'Neill from Saco and the legislature and the governor for making Maine the first state in the country to divest from fossil fuels. And my loser of the week, unfortunately, is also the governor because of vetoing the bill to close Long Creek. We cannot keep children in cages. We can have secure facilities, but we can't have 187 staff people and $600,000 a year caring for 27 kids with programs that don't work.
All right, Phil.
My loser of the week is really the heartbreak of the week. We've lost 4 children, 4 years and under, to manslaughter and murder charges. We as a society need to get to the root cause of these behaviors. My winner of the week is the town of Roxbury, Maine, and my former colleague on the Political Brew, John Richardson. A wind power facility was commissioned on Saturday that was erected in his honor.
Wow. There you go. And we can't forget John as we go into summer. All right. Thank you both very much. Thank you for joining us this week on Political Brew. News Center Maine continues right after this.